The United Nations says Israel and the Saudi-led coalition involved in the Yemen war were two of the main killers of children in the world in 2018. In a report to the Security Council seen by Reuters, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres blacklisted the coalition for the third year in a row. Guterres said the Saudi-led forces killed or injured over 700 children in Yemen last year. That is nearly half the total child casualties worldwide. Guterres also called on Israel to exercise restraint in dealing with Palestinians, saying the number of Palestinian kids killed in 2018 hit a record high in 2014. But he refrained from putting Israel on the UN list of shame. Israel and the Saudis have escaped the main UN blacklist of child killers in the recent years through behind-the-scene lobbying. Joining us to discuss this further in the studio, we have Sayyid Mohsin Abbas. He's a journalist and commentator. And we also have Marcus Papadopoulos, editor at Politics First, who joins us from London. Gentlemen, welcome. I unfortunately have an easy task of asking these questions because the data itself, the statistic, speaks for itself. So I'm just going to mention that, and you can then give us your reaction. First to you here in the studios, Sayyid Mohsin Abbas. 729 children killed in Yemen by the Saudi-led coalition, which equals to half the total of the world child casualties.
Well, I think it calls into question the whole issue of the UN and its legitimacy, because you see these reports come and they go. And actually, if we look at on the ground, if you like, action that gets taken, it's very minimal. It's really a question of viewing what the UN, in terms of its effectiveness on global peacekeeping, etc., or prevention of such crimes, really has. I mean, it's funded to the tune of 28% of its funding, I think, by the US, which again calls into question the United Nations' independence. And when you see or hear that nations like Israel and Saudi Arabia, very closely aligned to the US, get off scot-free from being put onto these lists or being pressured in any meaningful way, I think it really begs the question, is the UN really fit for purpose, as it's so loaded financially and so dependent on the United States and its interests across the world? It's a question which, of course, is the elephant in the room, but nobody really asks that question, because the way the United Nations is set up is in itself undemocratic. You have the veto power, which ultimately is the other weapon that can be used by the likes of the United States to get away with murder, literally. And in this case, with all these children being killed by the allies of the United States and people who are operating as proxies for the United States in the Middle East, is it any wonder that the likes of Ban Ki-moon have to back off from putting these countries on the list? Is it any wonder that Guterres has to come in with softly tactics? Other than just pressuring them indirectly, they don't really do anything directly to chastise these nations.
That's true, and this has obviously happened more than once when it comes to Saudi Arabia. But in the case of Israel, Marcus Papadopoulos, we have, 59 children to have been killed, and what's an eye-opener in a sense are the number injured, 2,456.
Well, for those of us who monitor the daily crimes against humanity committed by the Israeli and Saudi states, this United Nations report is not surprising. Indeed, it is old news. After all, the Israeli state and the Saudi state are two of the most malevolent states in the world after America and Britain. But we should also remember this, that yes, the Saudis and the Israelis are responsible for pulling the trigger against Yemenis and against Palestinians. The Israelis and the Saudis are responsible for the dropping of bombs against Palestinians and Yemenis. However, without those weapons, the Israelis and the Saudis would not be able to carry out their crimes against humanity to the extent that they are currently doing to this day. So therefore, we have to ultimately put the blame for the deaths of Palestinian children and Yemeni children at the feet of the Americans and the British, because without the military assistance from Washington and London, then the Israelis and the Saudis would not be able to commit to that full extent the crimes against humanity that they commit on a daily basis. And this United Nations report, whilst it is old news, will it be in the American Senate and condemned by the American Senate? No. Will it be discussed in the UK House of Commons and condemned by the UK House of Commons? No, because the Americans and the British are not sincere when they say that they are there to defend human rights. They are there to defend the rights and the welfare of children. They care nothing for human rights. They care nothing for children. But it's not just Palestinian children and Yemeni children who are suffering at the hands of the Israelis and the Saudis. How many Serbian children died at the hands of Bill Clinton, Madeleine Albright and Tony Blair through bombs and the dropping of uranium? How many Serbian children are abducted by the so-called Kosovo Liberation Army, taken to Albania and harvested for their organs? Where is the justice in the world? Will Tony Blair, will Bill Clinton, will Madeleine Albright, will Donald Trump, will Barack Obama ever face justice? And I mean justice. Will they appear in a war crimes court? Of course they won't, because the American and British establishments take care of their own. And I will say this, if there was justice in this world, then people like Obama and Clinton and Albright and Tony Blair would face a long and slow walk to the gallows for their crimes against humanity.
Mohsen Abbas, our guest there mentions the fact that the U.S. provides arms to Israel, for example, and to Saudi Arabia, and of course the coalition there. Does the U.S. then also share the blame? Because as a result, you're having, in this case, the report saying children that are being killed.
Absolutely, they have a pivotal role in causing all these deaths, but this is what the Western media, for instance, or the Western political system does. They like to try and obfuscate where the actual root causes of a problem are. They also don't go to the solutions. What they tend to do is focus on the symptoms and their proxies and their cronies in any particular area, and they distract their own general public with the notion that it's actually the failings of those regions and those localities or the regional players. Whereas in reality, absolutely, I agree with Marcus that actually most of these policies are planned, hatched, and, if you like, instrumentally rolled out from Westminster and from Washington. And unfortunately, they hide behind all of these other layers of political, if you like, obfuscation. And most of the general public either buy into it or are ambivalent, because millions of kids dying or hundreds of thousands of people dying far away from the capitals of the Western imperialist nations morally doesn't trigger with the people quite as much as, say, a bomb going off in London. And you know, for instance, the Afghan situation, the Afghanistan kids being killed is still top of the list on here. Yet will Britain, will America own up to the fact that they are the perpetrators and the prime drivers of warfare in that region for, I think, the longest period that the American army's certainly been at war anywhere is in Afghanistan, and it's children that they're targeting with so-called drone attacks, which are supposed to be precision bombing. Precision bombing of children doesn't sound very human rights orientated to me. They're not interested, I agree totally. But how do you pull up the Americans? Can the United Nations do that? I don't think they can. I don't think the United Nations is fit for purpose in that regard. It can come up with facts and statistics, but actually in terms of prevention, which is one of its remits or roles in 1945, that was one of its intended roles, or in terms of actually being able to really keep peace on the ground, I don't think they're fit for purpose.
Well, when it comes to weapons, Marcus Papadopoulos, and in the case of the Yemen war especially, you're having not an awakening, but rather a consensus within the politicians, by the politicians in the U.S., both Democrats and Republicans. They are trying to get the U.S. not to sell arms to Saudi Arabia specifically, and a lot of it is also, aside from the deaths that are happening in Yemen, which many are reported to be war crimes, happened to gain momentum after the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi. But yet you have the U.S. president who's going going to veto that or put an emergency order, executive order, in order for the arms to be sold. So in this case, does Donald Trump hold responsibility when it comes to Yemen and the deaths that are happening, including the foreign policy that Saudi Arabia is following when it comes to Yemen?
Well, whilst I applaud those American politicians who are criticizing Saudi Arabia's war against the people of Yemen, they don't go any further. If they really, really cared about the people of Yemen and how they are dying on a daily basis, including babies and toddlers, by American weapons, then they would call for a severing of diplomatic relations between Washington and Riyadh. Now, in regard to Donald Trump, yes, Donald Trump is enthusiastically pro-Saudi Arabia. His ties to the Saudi royal family go back to the 1980s, long, long before he started commenting on politics. But we must also remember that under Barack Obama, America started the flow, the increase of weapons to Saudi Arabia in order for Saudi Arabia to prosecute its brutal war in Yemen. So yes, we have to condemn Donald Trump. We have to hold him to account. He should, in an ideal world, be tried for crimes against humanity. But don't leave it with Donald Trump. That has to extend to Barack Obama. And also, if we're talking about Barack Obama, it is Barack Obama who supported or who commenced America's support for the numerous terrorist groups operating in Syria, including Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And how many Syrian children have been slaughtered by those repugnant groups in Syria? So yes, we need to condemn Donald Trump, but also we need to condemn Barack Obama for him being complicit in crimes against humanity in Yemen.
Very well, thank you. Wish we had more time. I'd like to appreciate your comments. Say Mohsen Abbas, political commentator here in the studios. Thank you so much. And Marcus Papadopoulos, editor at Politics First, who spoke to us from London. And that does it for our news review.